Good afternoon and welcome to the Catalan Cymru revision sessions. This session will focus on History A-Level, A2, and presented by me, Mr. Andrew Morel from e-sgol Llanidloes High School. The session will last around 45 minutes where I'll go through the relevant content, and if you have any questions, please use the question and answer section in the top right-hand corner of the screen, and I'll endeavour to answer your questions at the end of the session. The session will be recorded, and the PowerPoint resource I'm going to use will also be uploaded, or both will be uploaded, to the e-sgol website in the Catalan Cymru area. So, welcome back. Well done for returning to the last of the 4 sessions or the 4 recordings. Hopefully these have been of use to you and have helped you a little bit. Even if it's only a little bit, then I'm a happy man, frankly. So, what we're going to do today is, in our last session, we're going to assess a good essay. And if you remember back to when we looked at essay writing skills in Unit 3, I said what makes a good essay at Unit 3 also makes a good essay at Unit 4. Because back to the 3rd session, or in the recording of the 3rd session, I showed you the mark scheme for question 2, the essay question in Unit 4, and compared it briefly to the mark scheme in Unit 3. And we said for Band 6, so it's top level marks, it was virtually word for word the same. So what I said at Unit 3 in terms of essay writing, what I'm going to say today, I'm going to use an example from Unit 3, but nonetheless, these apply to your essays across both Unit 3 and Unit 4 as well. What makes a good essay makes a good essay. Doesn't matter if it's Unit 4, doesn't matter if it's Unit 3. So today then what we're going to do is we're going to assess a good essay, right? Unit 3 and 4, about 40-minute look at an exemplar essay. Before then, at the end, there'll be 5 minutes or so for question and answers if you've got any. So, as we're going, feel free to put them in the chat. Pardon me. There'll be time for me to look at them in the end. There's not anyone else on the call with me in order to look at them as we go along, but I will do it at the end, even if that means going back to the beginning at those questions at the end. No bother at all. Okay. So we looked at in session 2 and briefly then in session 3, we looked at the Band 6 characteristics, right? Things that would get you 27 to 30 marks out of 30 in one of these essay questions. And this is where these marks come from. Ultimately, right, there isn't that kind of you need to say this to get 2 marks, you need to say this to get 2 marks. This is what those marks come from, right? They're from band characteristics. And this ultimately, obviously, is what we're all aiming for, isn't it? Right? We're aiming for absolute top marks as high as we can possibly get. And you should be, right? You shouldn't let anything hold you back. Try and aim for those really top marks. So we saw that Band 6 characteristics were defined an essay as being lucid, convincing, and debating. Now, what we mean here, or what the examiners mean here, obviously I'm a teacher, not necessarily an examiner, what this means is that the debating is continual. It happens again and again and again. It isn't just a little bit of debate added here and now in the essay, or the debate is a for and against simple debate. It means your argument, right, in order for it to be convincing, your argument has merit among historians. So it means other historians might read it and think, that's a good idea. That stands up with what I know. That's what we mean by convincing. And if it's lucid, quite simply, it's easy to read. Lucid, easy to read. Don't make it any more complicated. Don't worry what that word lucid means. Just read it as easy to read instead. And so the main body, right, in terms of Band 6 characteristics, the response is specifically focused on covering the whole or nearly all of the set period and debating the key concept in the question set, and provides a substantiated, sustained, and integrated judgment. It demonstrates accurate, relevant, and precise knowledge of key features and characteristics associated with the theme. So what does this mean? Well, for it to be specifically focused on covering the whole of the set period, it means you have identified the key concept and, that's for debating the key concept. What's happened here? For covering the whole period, it means you've covered the whole time period in the question, right? Whether that's 1890 to 1990 or whether that's a different time period, you've covered the whole of it. In terms of debating the key concept, what it means is that you've identified that key concept, and then the answer is entirely focused on that concept. There's not any chance for anyone to say that you've drifted. Right? Famous, popular thing to write in the margin is drift, right? drifting away from what the question is specifically answering you. So you need to keep it tight to the specific question. Where it says sustained and integrated judgment, it means your judgment is evidenced with examples and it's pursued throughout the essay. In order for something to be sustained, it doesn't just happen at the end. It happens throughout. And for it to be integrated, it also means it's going to be throughout. For it to be substantiated, that is where you're evidencing it. That's the key to that. And precise knowledge, well, you use accurate and specific facts to back your debate up. So you're using facts, but these are as accurate and specific as you can possibly make them, right? Not just things that you could have said without having studied this module or this theme or whatever it is you're writing on for half a year per theme, isn't it? A year in total. So the very, very first thing you do, right? You've turned up in the exam or you've been given a question by your teacher. The very, very first thing you need to do is you need to look at the question and really drill down into it, or as I like to call it, explode the question. And in order to do that, then you need to identify the time period, the factor in the question, and the key concept to find debate in order to really, really hone in on debate. So in this case, start with the time period. It's always the easiest to do. The time period is 1919 to 1941. So you've got to go back as early as 1919, and you've got to go as far forward as 1941, trying to encompass both. Now, in this case, it's fairly straightforward, and I'll tell you why when we look at the essay in a minute. Not always that straightforward. Well, in this case, 1919 is the signing of the peace treaties, which America refused to join. 1941 is when America joined the Second World War. Sometimes it's not as easy as that, particularly in the 100-year spread. So I suppose that's why they put in the band 6 characteristics, covering the whole or nearly all of the whole of the set period. But you need to do your absolute best to make sure you cover it all. So the question then, how far do you agree that US foreign policy was mainly isolationist in the period 1919 to 1941? 30 marks, always 30 marks. And this is from the specimen assessment from the WJC. So this isn't a question I've made up. This has come direct from the exam board themselves. So if that's our time period, what is going to be our factor in the question? Well, our factor in the question is US foreign policy. We are specifically talking about US foreign policy. Now, this question is written maybe slightly differently to some that you might see. If it was to what extent did John Foster Dulles, or to what extent was John Foster Dulles the most significant individual in US foreign policy between 1890 and 1990, then your factor is John Foster Dulles, and you talk about more than just John Foster Dulles. But because this whole theme is about foreign policy, and it asks you specifically about foreign policy, then you'd just be discussing foreign policy. You wouldn't be discussing economic policy during this essay. And then the debate is, how far was it mainly isolationist? Mainly isolationist. So remember back to the second session, I talked about those debating words, right? Mainly is that debating word. If this question said, how far do you agree that US foreign policy was isolationist in the period 1919 to 1941? Your answer could be yes, it was, or no, it wasn't. But as soon as you throw that word mainly in, how far do you agree that US foreign policy was mainly isolationist in the period 1919 to 1941? It gives room for debate. It opens it up to a spectrum where you can say, well, it kind of was isolation. It was very much isolation. It wasn't isolation. It kind of was internationalist. It very much was internationalist. And it's that word that facilitates this debate and is needed to be used, mainly isolationist, right, along with isolationism as well. Now, one quick thing to say here, right, and I'll write this down on the screen, is what the exam board has said is that both questions for Unit 3, it's not writing for some reason, both questions will be the 100-year period. My computer's lagging a little bit there, isn't it? So even though this question has come from Unit 3, right, it wouldn't be in the exam because it's going to be a 100-year period for both Section A and Section B. But nonetheless, in Unit 4, your time period is a lot shorter, and it might represent, just like this one does, a period of just 22 years. And nevertheless, what makes a good essay makes a good essay, right? Whether that is a Section A essay, a Section B essay, a Unit 4 essay, or a Unit 3 essay. And that mark scheme, those band characteristics are exactly the same, whether it is Section A or Section B, Unit 3 or Unit 4. So there we go, right? Time period identified, factor identified, and the key thing, the key concept in order to find the debate identified as well. Sorry. So here we go, right? Band 6, we're talking those features we saw earlier, 27 to 30 marks. Band 5 is 21 to 25 marks. Now, I'll be honest, and I'll probably say that the essay I'm about to go through with you would be a Band 5. I wouldn't ever profess to be able to write or to be able to edit whatever a 30-mark essay. It's just not possible for me, I would have thought. But nonetheless, if you were to get 25 marks, you'd be getting an A star. If you were to be getting 21 marks, you'd probably be an A. So nonetheless, this is going to give you access to those top grades anyway. So reaching that substantiated, sustained, and integrated judgment is absolutely key to this. And it starts with your introduction, right from the beginning. Because your introduction sets out what your judgment is going to be, and that allows you to make sure it's integrated throughout as you go along. So I always say, and using this little picture in the top right to kind of spark the memory, I always say to write an answer in a nutshell as your introduction. Because overall, right, in order to make it a sustained and integrated judgment, overall, we need to know what your argument is going to be. And it's not a whodunit novel. It's not an episode of the Peaky Blinders where, or probably even better analogy here, Line of Duty, right? It's not an episode of Line of Duty where after 6 series, you still don't know who H is, right? I want to know right now, right at the beginning. We want to know from the start what your argument is going to be. Because if you don't know what your argument is going to be from the start, then how are you going to be able to integrate that argument, that judgment throughout the whole essay? So set it out right at the beginning. Briefly define the key terms, right? The key things you're going to be discussing, and don't waste your time with a long introduction. Introductions aren't the bit where you're going to be picking up the marks for debating the key concepts, sustaining and integrating your judgment, showing off precise knowledge. Introduction sets the tone, that's all, okay? So don't waste your time on that long introduction. So this is how long my introduction would be. So bear in mind our question, how far do you agree that US foreign policy was mainly isolationist in the period 1919 to 1941? This is what my introduction would be. The variety of US foreign policy over this period does not necessarily mean inconsistency. The definition of consistent isolation in this context relies on the removal from world affairs militarily, politically, and economically. However, this period saw a divergence between a congressional aim to respect isolation of public opinion and a reality, often presidential-led, of the fact that the USA needed to engage abroad to protect its economic interests. So you can see what I'm going to be arguing here is that protectionism, that protectionism, which is to do with the economy, is not going to be seen at this time. So we're thinking non-protectionism. But non-intervention, right, that idea that war or diplomatic relations is not going to be seen as well, right? That is not happening during this time period, at least I would argue in my essay. So I've set out from the very beginning then what my argument is going to be. It's going to be more that the USA is isolationist when it comes to non-intervention, when it comes to using its military, when it comes to diplomatic relations, but it's going to be much less isolationist when we talk about protectionism, when we talk about shutting off its economy. USA tends to be a lot more open. What I'm arguing in this essay tends to be a lot less isolationist about its economy in order to benefit from economic relations with other countries, things like that. So that's my introduction, sets out where I'm going, briefly defines the key terms, right? I'm talking isolation means removal from world affairs militarily, politically, and economically. That's what I'm saying isolationism means. Now, the reason you've got to do that is because you've got to kind of frame the terms of what it is that you're going to be discussing, in order to prove, I suppose, in some ways, that you know what that term means, what isolationist means. Now, for the rest of the essay then, right, I'm going to be looking for these, right? A point, an introductory sentence in your paragraph. A backup point with some facts or detail in your evidence, right? Backs up that point. When we're talking from the mark scheme, we're talking specific facts. Let me use the exact word: precise, accurate, relevant, and precise knowledge. This bit just here. That means you need to provide specific facts and details to back up your point of view. A bit of an explanation. How is this evidence important? Evaluation. Is this evidence more important than other pieces of evidence? In other words, another thing people just say there instead is link rather than evaluate. So link it back to your previous paragraphs. And hopefully you'll notice this as we go through it in a minute. And then conclude, what kind of point have you made in your paragraph? So here's my first paragraph, right? So as you go, think, or as we read it, think, and I'll highlight afterwards, but think, where is the point? Where is the evidence? Where is the explanation? Is there any evaluation? Or why isn't there evaluation, at least in this first paragraph? And then is there a link on to the next bit? So following the First World War, America refused to sign the peace treaties in Europe or join the League of Nations. This was a huge blow to the peace settlement in Europe and had huge repercussions for the world order. To a large extent, this shows that America retreated into isolationism after the war, most notably because of the pervasion of a never again attitude. The role of Congress was essential in isolationism developing as a Republican-dominated House refused to ratify the peace treaties in both March 1919 and November 1920. The sentiments of many Republicans were shown through Congressman Victor Berger, who suggested that the First World War was an imperialistic war that led to nothing but billions of dollars of debt and thousands of lost lives, in so doing, turning the Monroe Doctrine on its head. This points to a fundamental difference in foreign policy thinking between the isolationist Congress and internationalist-looking presidency of Wilson. After all, many of the articles of the Treaty of Versailles were similar to Wilson's 14 points. For example, Wilson wanted a liberal peace program with the General Association of Nations that makes the League of Nations. This was almost identical to Articles 1 to 26 of the treaty. Furthermore, Wilson was explicit in wanting to seize the initiative to make the United States the moral leaders of the international climate and continue America's central role in Europe. Nevertheless, a Democrat loss in the 1918 Congress midterm elections and a stroke suffered by Wilson prevented him from being able to effectively articulate his internationalist vision and gather the support needed. It is unsurprising Congress wanted to prioritize America's needs and maintain American support rather than position in international relations. Thus, the never again attitude won over, driving the United States into an inward-looking isolationism that would be seized on by Republican presidents Hoover and Coolidge. So, my initial point is in this first two sentences. Following the First War, America refused to sign the peace treaties and join the League of Nations. Huge blow to the peace settlement, and to a large extent, this shows that America retreated into isolationism after the war, most notably because of the pervasion of a never again attitude. That is your point. My evidence to back this up goes this far. Goes as far as this point here, right? This is my evidence. These are specific things to back this up. The fact that Congress didn't ratify the peace treaties. The fact that Congressman Victor Berger stated this. They are evidence of that retreat into isolationism. Evidence is my point. The next bit is my explanation. And this goes as far pretty much to the end, just quite last sentence. This is my explanation. This is where I'm starting to explain why that is important to our question, why it shows that isolationism is being achieved, why we can suggest that the country America was mainly isolationist. And then the last bit, this last bit, is my concluding point / my link to the next paragraph. All right, my link to the next paragraph. Now, there's no evaluation here, and the reason being is because this is the first paragraph. I've got nothing before it to compare it to. Now, in some ways, it's harder to evaluate when you're doing a question like this, when you're kind of almost following chronologically, looking at the time period 1919 to 1941, rather than looking at factors. If, for example, it was the person, like the one I suggested earlier about John Foster Dulles, the most significant individual in US foreign policy 1890 to 1990. You talk about John Foster Dulles, then when you talk about the next person, you explicitly compare him to John Foster Dulles. It's a little bit harder than that in this when you're kind of moving through the time period, but nonetheless, you can link between the paragraphs, and that is how you can then begin to evaluate and how you begin to kind of draw conclusions. So that's my first paragraph. My second paragraph would be this. Furthermore, the 1920s was dominated by Republican presidents Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge. And this continued that post-war isolationism as they, like Congress, were focused on domestic issues rather than foreign affairs. The war had made America the strongest industrial producer in the world, and this had spurred a wave of economic nationalism, evidenced by the 1922 Ford-Macumber Act, which introduced the highest tariffs on imports by any US government. This demonstrates the potent protectionist, isolationist tendencies in US foreign policy in the 1920s, as well as establishing the significance of protectionists in promoting American priorities. Additionally, the increase in import tariffs would have created tension with America's allies, conveying the extent to which Republicans were willing to go in order to prevent internationalism prospering. The early 1920s saw America dive into an economic, political, and military isolationism, and America was in part of the non-League of Nations Pact, limiting the significance of internationalism. So, same thing, thinking about our peak. So, our first sentence in this creates my point. Following that then, from the war, I'm using the Ford-Macumber Act in order to give some evidence behind my suggestion. So my first paragraph was thinking about non-interventionism. This paragraph is thinking about protectionism, another element of isolationism. Following that then, right, I've begun to explain. That next sentence is my explain. Whilst this last sentence here, or second to last, sorry, is a beginning of an evaluation because I'm trying to compare. And then that last sentence is the conclusion and link. Okay. So I'm kind of going through that same process of making a point, then evidencing it, giving some cold, hard facts, precise knowledge. Then I'm explaining it. Before then, I'm trying to evaluate and link it to the others. And that evaluation, that linking is always the hardest. It's always the hardest to try and link back, to evaluate, to make sure that argument is pursued throughout. So you'd have noticed my first paragraph was much bigger, right? It was about non-interventionism. This paragraph is smaller, principally because actually in my overall argument, I'm saying that America was more internationalist, more out there in international climate, and so less mainly isolationist when it came to the economy. So I haven't got as much evidence to offer there, have I? Because overall my argument is going to be that America was more internationalist or less isolationist when it came to the economy. And hence why I've got less evidence to offer than, say, the previous paragraph, where I'm saying in terms of military involvement, diplomacy, they were isolationists, they were staying out. So I've got more evidence to offer. Next paragraph. And the first thing I want to point out to you here is my beginning of this paragraph with the phrase, on the other hand. What it's doing there is it is showing that I'm looking at another angle. I'm analysing, I'm signposting the exam to the fact I'm looking at it from another angle. So at the moment, I've got an argument for, and now I'm going to have an argument against. So bear that in your heads for now, right? Bear that in mind. I've got argument for, argument against, and we'll see how this essay progresses to see what goes on from there, and whether it just stays as an argument for, argument against, or develops. So on the other hand, America was significantly involved in disarmament discussions, limiting the dominance of isolationism in the US foreign policy and thus the assertion of being mainly isolationist. For instance, in 1921, 9 powers met, including America, to discuss the arms race as part of the Washington Naval Conference, and it was in fact the US Secretary of State, Charles Hughes, who suggested destroying ships purposefully in order to reduce the buildup of navies. Such a central role in the disarmament conference demonstrates that America was interested in the direction of foreign affairs, despite its claim to be totally isolationist. particularly due to their desire to control Japan. America also created the Dawes Plan in 1924 to deal with the issue of reparations and ensuring they continued to receive loan repayments from the Allies to bolster their economy. While it was also at the forefront of creating the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928, designed as a multilateral agreement to eliminate war as an instrument of national policy. America's involvement and leadership in these plans are significant because they suggest isolationism was significantly tempered, particularly when it came to benefiting the American economy. The 1920s established America as a global political leader, therefore suggesting they are not as isolationist as they claimed, indicating a move to internationalism. So that paragraph very clearly gives a different side of the argument, doesn't it? And very clearly given a more internationalist outlook. So the first two paragraphs looking at why it was mainly isolationist. Now I've started to look at why it wasn't so isolationist. Same thing going on here. Initially, we've got our point. That takes us through to the end of the first sentence. Right, our point. Then after that, we've got our evidence. And our evidence goes through to, from the same area here, through to, I'm just double checking in my head, I've got this right, American involvement here. Because in there, I'm offering evidence about the Dawes Plan, I'm offering evidence about the Kellogg-Briand Pact, the Naval Conference, I've given a specific example of the person involved and how it showed that America particularly was leading with disarmament and trying to get involved internationally in order to ensure there was no war again. Following this then, I have begun to explain and evaluate. Right? Explain and evaluate in one, really, I'd say. Now, I've offered a lot of evidence there because it is the first time I've mentioned the other side of the argument. So I'm introducing a lot of evidence. And this last sentence is again your conclusion / your link. Right? The 1920s established America as a global political leader, therefore suggesting they were not isolationists as they claimed, indicating a move to internationalism. So I'm linking back to the previous two paragraphs, the claims that they were isolationists by refusing to join the peace treaties, the League of Nations, etc. And I'm kind of summing my argument of that paragraph up as well. So, note now the beginning of the next paragraph. However. So if we think about it, I'm going to squeeze this in the side, right? Initially, we had two paragraphs that were for and for. They are for the argument that America was mainly isolationist. Then we had the one that was against, that suggested America wasn't mainly isolationist. Now we are going back to a for. So note that as we get to the next one, we'll note it again, see where it's going, see where it's moving. However, it could be argued that the motives behind such policies as the Washington Naval Conference was to extract themselves from the international arena, as it would result in disarmament and allow America to retreat to domestic issues only. There is our point, our initial point. Furthermore, this supposed shift to internationalism was stunted due to the 1929 Wall Street crash and the rising aggression in Europe and Japanese invasion of Manchuria. These were met with no economic or military sanctions, as they were focused on depression recovery, and the public avidly opposed interventionism, thus conveying an isolationist mood, which can be seen in a survey carried out by the Nye Committee in 1931, where 70% of Americans claimed to be against the decision to join World War I. So there is our evidence. That is our evidence of more evidence to add to that idea that America was mainly isolationist. The Wall Street crash and the Nye Committee and its findings. So moving on from that then, what we've got is we've got our explanation and our evaluation to some extent as well. This demonstrates that the horrors of war played a huge role in Congress's attitudes to foreign policy, as they refused again to join the world arena, further emphasizing their aim to ensure a mainly isolationist approach to foreign policy between 1919 and 1941. Furthermore, the 1935 Johnson Act, passed by Congress, refused to loan money to countries that hadn't repaid war debts, emphasizing the protectionist, isolationist policy America advocated and further alienated America's allies. So there we have our explanation and our evaluation. In fact, apologies, It's the next sentence on, isn't it? Furthermore, the 1935-1936 Congressional Neutrality Act prevented US arms involvement in war and preventing loans to belligerents. That is more explanation, or actually, in fact, it is more evidence again, isn't it? Another bit of evidence. These acts showed that Congress's firmly isolationist intentions and demonstrated the firm continuance of Congress's isolationist aims, straitjacketing the president. So there is my conclusion and my link, right? When I'm saying further straitjacketing, right, or continuing of Congress's straitjacketing, I'm referring back to that first paragraph where I talked about Victor Berger and Congress refusing to ratify the peace treaties, refusing to allow America to join the League of Nations. So, we had a 4-paragraph, then another 4-paragraph, then an against, then another 4. Let's read this and see which this one is. In contrast, the 1937 Neutrality Act, passed due to Roosevelt's pressure on Congress to remove the obstacles of the previous Neutrality Acts, gave a concession to the president to use to allow his foreign countries to purchase US arms if they were paid for and taken away on purchase. This cash and carry principle allowed the president to shift focus of foreign policy for economic gain as a precursor to interventionism. Additionally, Roosevelt's good neighborly policy saw America follow its constant thread through all foreign policy of keeping a keen economic interest in Latin America. Despite its aim to reduce political involvement in Latin America and end the Platt Amendment, it does highlight the nuance in US foreign policy, as while America was still mainly isolationist in Europe, they were far more internationalist in terms of economic intervention elsewhere. This isolationism shared closely the same motives of the Dawes Plan of involving themselves internationally to benefit, essentially, their economy. So this is an argument, a paragraph that is against. And I'm going to stop and pause for a second to think about this. If you're engaging in a debate, you're not giving your opinion, waiting for someone to give their opinion back, and then concluding and moving on. In a debate, you give your opinion, you wait for someone to give their opinion back, then you come back at them with other evidence, then they come back at you with other evidence, then you go back at them with other evidence, then they come back at you with other evidence, and then you might conclude and move on. That is a debate. So if you're looking at the mark schemes, for example, right, you might see the indicative content. It's got argument for, argument against, right? You need your for and against. Why in this case it was mainly isolationist, or why in this case it wasn't mainly isolationist. But you can't just simply state your for and then your against argument, because as soon as you do that, it's not a debate. It's a for and against statement, and that's it. So that's why you can see here we've got a 4-paragraph, a 4-paragraph, 2 paragraphs that said it was mainly isolationist, then one that said it wasn't, then another one that said it is, and another one that said it wasn't. Because you're debating back and forth then, and that's what they want to see. So in contrast, there's another good sentence phrase to kind of point that out to the examiners in order to get you thinking from that other perspective as well. So in contrast through to purchase is our point. Cash and carry principle through to good neighborly policy is our evidence. And then through to the last sentence is our explanation. So our point, our evidence, our explanation, and then our link. This last bit in particular is a link, isn't it, to what we saw earlier with the Dawes Plan. And think back to my introduction. In fact, let's go back to the introduction, where I said it's going to engage abroad to protect its economic interests. That is something I have sustained in this paragraph here. This isolationism shared closely the same motives of the Dawes Plan of involving themselves internationally to benefit, essentially, their economy. So, next paragraph, right, is however. So again, remember we had a 4-paragraph, then a 4, then an against, then another 4. The last one we looked at was another against. Let's have a look and see what this one is. However, it is clear that non-interventionism was central to American foreign policy after the sinking of USS Panay by Japan in 1937 was met with zero action. Although the Japanese apologized and compensated America for this action, it was still enough justification for war, as it was a direct attack on US military and civilians escaping a Japanese invasion. When America allowed Jews to settle in America after the Kristallnacht, they took no direct action, highlighting that isolationism was still active, albeit less so, during America's most internationalist years in the period 1919 to 41. This isolationism was replicated in Roosevelt's muted role in Munich Conference and lack of involvement in the appeasement policy. These reflect earlier attitudes towards isolationism of preferring a disarmament route to ultimately remove themselves from the international sphere, as seen in the Washington Naval Conference, than a policy which would see interventionism abroad. So this then is another 4. Another paragraph suggesting that America was mainly isolationist. Now, for this paragraph and the next one, I'll let you go back yourselves and highlight the P for the point, the E for the evidence, the E for the explanation, evaluate the link. But you can see here, we're building that. So this last paragraph then, right, so let's just write here again, I'll do just letters, right, 4, against, 4, against, and we just had another 4. So here we go. Does this one agree that America was mainly isolationist, or does it disagree? Well, arguably, Roosevelt's presidency saw a shift away from a dominantly isolationist America to an internationalist one, particularly in his second term from 1937. This can be seen early on, such as the 1934 Reciprocal Trade Act, reducing tariffs by 80% with favoured nations, and the Lend-Lease Bill in 1941, allowing the US president by executive order to lend lease arms to any country whose defence was vital to the USA. This is significant because it allowed Roosevelt to escape the isolationist straitjacket of Congress and conduct foreign affairs with greater independence. The US's internationalist agenda is not only seen with this legislation, but also through the personal friendships such as that of Roosevelt and British PM Churchill, whom together created the Atlantic Charter of 1941 in order to uphold international democracy. This conveys America's desire to spread American values and get involved militarily, therefore highlighting that in the late 1930s, US foreign policy was mainly internationalist. Nevertheless, from all these actions, America stood to benefit economically as it had seen in the First World War. So that paragraph is against. It's against the idea it's mainly isolationist, because instead it says it was mainly internationalist. So you've got that debate structure I was talking about, right? Remember, if you're having a discussion with your friends, right, you're not giving your opinion, they give their opinion, you conclude and you move on. They give their opinion, you give your opinion, they come back at you with a bit more information, you come back at them with a bit more information, you go back at them with a bit more information, then you might conclude and move on. That's the debate, isn't it? So replicate that in the structure of your paragraphs and use those words, as I will come back to in a second, use those words to create that structure. You can also see, right, my argument is being sustained, right? I'm sustaining the idea that America was involved in order to benefit its economy, you know what I mean, okay? Again, you yourselves, right, afterwards, after the session, go back and look and see where you can identify the peak structure there. And this then would be my conclusion. So this way, hopefully you'll see the idea of conclusion is you're drawing all your mini conclusions together. Was it isolationist then? Was it isolationist then? Into an overall answer of whether or not it was mainly isolationist across the whole time period. Overall, US foreign policy was not mainly isolationist, but in fact mainly internationalist in the period 1919 to 1941. As America adapted more internationalist policies as the build-up to war began, and if it weren't for Congress's adamant never again attitude, isolationists would have died out much quicker. The post-war peace settlement was definitely isolationist, as America did not sign the peace treaties. However, they still played a significant role in creating them through international cooperation. This international cooperation is consistent in the time period, even in the 1920s and the disarmament conference, when the USA claimed to be entirely isolationist. While the 1930s saw some focus on domestic issues and some reluctance to get internationally involved, isolationism declined as Roosevelt encouraged Congress to become more internationalist due to the threat of war, as seen in the Lend-Lease Bill, for example. Furthermore, a constant thread running through the whole period is one of seeking economic benefit abroad. Therefore, it is undeniable that US foreign policy was mainly isolationist. However, this was majorly due to the increasing threat of international aggression, and it must be said that isolationists was more active in the first half of the period. I apologise profusely. That should say internationalist. This just proves, isn't it, the need to double check what you've written if you have time at the end of your exam. So you can see what I've tried to do there. I've tried to bring back issues from across the period that I was discussing, across the different paragraphs I was discussing, pull them together into some sort of bigger judgment, where I have then also pursued the same argument throughout. The economic benefit is what motivated the United States to be involved abroad. So overall then, this is what my structure is. This is one of those planning documents I suggested to you in a previous session. Okay, the question in the middle, period coverage, making sure you're covering the whole period and you've got things from each bit. Evidence support the proposition, in this case that it was mainly isolationist. Evidence to enter into debate about it, in this case that it wasn't mainly isolationist. And you can see then that I have introduced 1, 2, 3, 4 paragraphs that say it was mainly isolationist, and 1, 2, 3 paragraphs that say it wasn't. And these would have come from my planning in these individual boxes here. And that 4 against, 4 against, 4 against argument creates that debate. And you can see in terms of diagrammatically, my introduction is small, right, in proportion to the rest of it. That's how it should be. My conclusion is proportionately bigger than the rest of it. That is how it should be. That's what the kind of shape of your essay should look like as well. Hopefully that has been enlightening or at least helpful. And that then is our 4th session over and done with. So all that leaves me to say is a massive thank you. Thank you very much for joining us over the last 4 weeks. And hopefully those tips I've shared with you will help you succeed in your history A level. And all I can do is wish you the very, very best in your exams when they do eventually come, one before May half term, one just after May half term. Fingers crossed you do all right. And finally, any questions, please post them in the chat now. I'll have a look and see if there are any, and I'll do my best to answer them. If you've got any, please pause for 30 seconds or so to see if anyone's got any additional ones to add in. Looks like no new questions. So in that case, I will bid you a very, very fond farewell and say all the very, very best. Thank you very much. Goodbye.